What if I told you that the person who could have saved a missing child was wearing a uniform you're taught to trust? For 19 years, Emma Johnson's family searched for answers in one of America's most visited parks, while the truth was buried just beneath their feet. I've investigated dozens of missing children cases over the years, but there's something uniquely disturbing about disappearances that happen in plain sight, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses who saw absolutely nothing. We teach our kids that public places are safe, that uniformed workers are there to help, that screaming for help in a crowded park will bring rescue. And then cases like Emma Johnson shatter every assumption we've built our sense of security upon. When a 7-year-old vanishes in broad daylight from Central Park's Sheep Meadow on a perfect spring afternoon in 2002, you'd think someone would have seen something, anything. But that's not how these mysterious disappearances unfold. What makes Emma's case particularly haunting isn't just the vanished kid story or the years of unanswered questions that tore her family apart. It's the shocking revelation that came 19 years later when a dying park worker walked into a police station and confessed to a secret he'd buried along with her body. This isn't one of those cold cases where we're left wondering what happened, where theories and speculation fill the void of evidence. This is a case where we got answers, and somehow those answers are more disturbing than the mystery itself, because what Robert Mitchell revealed in his deathbed confession exposes a dark truth about how quickly a moment of panic can destroy lives, and how someone can walk past a child's grave for nearly 2 decades while her parents desperately searched for any sign she was still alive. The details of what happened that May afternoon, what Mitchell did in those critical moments, and why he chose silence over salvation will challenge everything you thought you knew about missing persons cases and the people we trust to keep our children safe. This is Emma Johnson's story, and it's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the obvious predator, but the one who makes a choice to protect themselves at the cost of an innocent life and a family's peace. I'll never forget the first time I came across Emma Johnson's file. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in May 2002 when 7-year-old Emma vanished without a trace from Central Park's Sheep Meadow. And what struck me most wasn't just the missing children reports or the cold cases I'd studied before. It was how quickly everything fell apart. Emma had been playing with her older brother near the meadow while their parents set up a picnic just 50 feet away. One of those perfect spring days where families flood the park and the air smells like hot dogs and fresh-cut grass. Her mother glanced down to grab sandwiches from the cooler, her father was tossing a frisbee with their son, and in those 15 seconds, literally 15 seconds, Emma disappeared. No screams, no struggle, no witnesses who saw anything unusual despite hundreds of people scattered across that massive lawn. What haunts me about this case, and what makes it one of the most mysterious disappearances in Central Park's history, is that Emma didn't just wander off. She vanished in broad daylight, surrounded by people in one of the most surveilled public spaces in America. Does this work for you? Or would you like any adjustments? The NYPD response was immediate and massive, something I've rarely seen matched in other missing persons cases from that era. Within 20 minutes of the 911 call, Central Park was swarming with officers, K-9 units, and mounted police combing every inch of the 843-acre park. They shut down entrances, stopped every vehicle leaving the area, and interviewed hundreds of parkgoers who'd been near Sheep Meadow that afternoon. Emma's description went out across every news channel in New York. Blonde hair, blue eyes, wearing a pink Disney princess t-shirt and denim overalls. A detail that still breaks my heart, because that's what thousands of little girls wore in 2002. The search dogs picked up her scent heading northeast toward the Ramble, that dense winding section of the park where the paths twist like a labyrinth and the trees create shadows even in daylight, but then the trail just stopped cold near the Bow Bridge. What destroyed Emma's parents in those first 72 hours wasn't just the lack of evidence. It was watching hope die a little more with each passing hour, seeing their daughter's face on every news channel, while knowing statistically that after 48 hours, the chances of finding a missing child alive dropped to almost nothing. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing footage that would play on loop for weeks. Divers searched the lake and every body of water in the park. And volunteers formed human chains walking shoulder to shoulder through the wooded areas. But 72 hours later, they had absolutely nothing. I've spent countless hours reviewing the investigative files from 2002 to 2004, and what's frustrating is how many leads seemed promising at first, but crumbled under scrutiny. Detectives chased down over 300 tips in the first month alone. a suspicious man in a gray hoodie near the Meadow, a white van spotted on the East Drive, even a park vendor who'd been fired for inappropriate behavior with children. But every single lead hit a dead end. They pulled security footage from businesses along Central Park West and Fifth Avenue, interviewed every registered sex offender within a 5-mile radius, and cross-referenced Emma's disappearance with similar unsolved cases across the country, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial predator. One particular theory gained traction when a witness claimed to have seen a maintenance worker acting nervous near the ramble around the time Emma's scent disappeared, but that worker had an airtight alibi. He'd been on camera at the park's maintenance facility punching out for lunch. The FBI got involved. Psychological profilers built complex theories about who might have taken her, and America's Most Wanted featured Emma's case in late 2002 and again in 2004. Generating thousands more calls that all led nowhere. By 2005, the case went cold, and Emma became just another unsolved case in the database of true crime stories that haunt this city, filed away with hundreds of other heartbreaking mysteries, while her parents were left with nothing but age-progressed photos and the agonizing question: where did their little girl go? The Johnson family never stopped searching, even when the rest of the world moved on to the next tragedy. I reached out to Emma's mother in 2019, and she told me something that still echoes in my mind. She said every May on the anniversary of Emma's disappearance, she'd walk through Central Park retracing their steps from that day, hoping somehow her daughter would just appear. The family created a website, held annual vigils at Sheep Meadow, and plastered missing children posters across New York City. But as the years crawled by, 2006, 2008, 2010, the media stopped covering Emma's story, and the tips dried up completely. Her brother, who'd been playing frisbee, that day grew up carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear. And Emma's father threw himself into advocacy work for other families of vanished kids, channeling his pain into something productive, because sitting still with that kind of grief will destroy you. The detectives who'd originally worked the case retired, files got transferred to new investigators who had their own active cases to solve, and Emma became another name in the ever-growing database of cold cases and mysterious disappearances. What's haunting about these years of silence isn't just the absence of answers, it's how a family is forced to exist in this limbo, unable to move forward, but trapped in a nightmare that never ends. But sometimes, in the darkest cold cases, the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. In March 2021, nearly 19 years after Emma vanished, a call came into the NYPD cold case unit that changed everything. A man named Robert Mitchell, a former Central Park maintenance worker who'd been employed by the Parks Department back in 2002, walked into the precinct and told detectives he needed to talk about Emma Johnson. And I remember reading the initial report thinking this was just another false confession, something we see all the time in high-profile missing children cases. But Mitchell was not seeking attention or trying to insert himself into the investigation for some twisted psychological reason. He was 61 years old, recently diagnosed with terminal cancer, and according to the detective who interviewed him, he looked like a man whose conscience had been eating him alive for 2 decades. He didn't come in with a lawyer, didn't ask for immunity, just sat down in that interrogation room and said 5 words that made everyone's blood run cold. "I know what happened to Emma." The timing wasn't coincidental. Mitchell had maybe 6 months to live, and facing death has a way of making people confront the secrets they've buried, the lies they've told themselves to sleep at night. What he was about to reveal wouldn't just crack open a cold case that had haunted New York for nearly 20 years. It would expose a truth so shocking that even seasoned detectives who'd seen the worst of humanity found themselves struggling to process it. Mitchell's confession unfolded over 6 hours of recorded testimony, and what he described was both simpler and more horrifying than anyone had imagined. He told detectives that on May 18, 2002, he'd been working his regular shift maintaining the pathways near the Ramble when he saw Emma wandering alone, looking confused and calling for her parents. And here's where the story takes a turn that still makes my stomach drop. Mitchell claimed he approached her to help, told her he'd take her to the park office where they could announce her name over the loudspeakers, a perfectly reasonable thing for a park employee to do, and Emma, being a trusting 7-year-old who'd been taught that uniformed workers were safe, went with him. But instead of heading to the office, Mitchell led her deeper into the Ramble toward an old maintenance shed that's been demolished since 2015. And what happened in those next moments, according to his confession, was an accident he'd covered up out of sheer panic. He said Emma slipped on the shed's concrete steps, hit her head hard, and by the time he realized how serious it was, she wasn't breathing. But here's what didn't add up. Emma's family said she was extremely coordinated for her age, had taken gymnastics for 2 years, and the shed steps Mitchell described? Only 3 steps, less than 2 feet high. Detectives pushed him hard on this. Why didn't he call 911? Why didn't he try CPR? Why didn't he do anything a rational person would do? And Mitchell's answers kept shifting. First, he said he panicked immediately. Then he claimed he tried to wake her for a few minutes. Then suddenly he couldn't remember exactly how long he waited before making the decision that would haunt 2 families for nearly 2 decades. The detectives pressed him on whether this was truly an accident or something far more sinister, whether he's suddenly the victim here or a murderer trying to minimize culpability. But what came next in his confession would provide details only someone who was actually there could possibly know. What made Mitchell's confession credible, what separated it from the dozens of false confessions that had plagued this case, were the specific details he provided that had never been released to the public. He described the exact Disney princess on Emma's t-shirt, Cinderella, not just a princess. And he knew about a small birthmark on her left ankle that only family and investigators knew existed, details you can't just Google or pick up from news reports. Mitchell led detectives to a remote section of the park near the North Woods, an area so overgrown and rarely visited that even regular park-goers don't know it exists, and pointed to a spot beneath what used to be that old maintenance shed's foundation. When the forensic team excavated the area over 3 painstaking days, they found remains buried in a shallow grave wrapped in a tarp that had deteriorated but still showed traces of the Parks Department logo from the early 2000s, and DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. They'd found Emma Johnson. The medical examiner's report concluded that Emma had indeed suffered severe head trauma consistent with a fall, though they couldn't rule out that Mitchell's story was a carefully constructed lie to minimize his culpability, a way to frame murder as manslaughter, as tragic accident, rather than deliberate act. Mitchell died 4 months later in a prison hospital before he could stand trial, taking whatever additional truths he might have hidden to his grave, and the Johnson family was left with an answer that somehow felt worse than not knowing. Because now they understood that their daughter had been within that park the entire time, buried just miles from where they'd held those annual vigils. And the man who could have saved her, who could have called for help, who could have done the right thing, chose instead to protect himself and let a family suffer in agonizing uncertainty for 19 years. Emma Johnson. Story isn't just another cold case that got solved, it's a reminder that the truth does not always bring the closure we desperately hope for. For 19 years, the Johnson family lived in agonizing uncertainty, holding on to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Emma was still out there somewhere, alive and waiting to be found. But the answer they finally received was somehow more painful than the mystery itself. Their daughter had been in Central Park the whole time, just beneath the ground where they'd held vigils and scattered flowers every May, while the man who could have saved her walked free, carrying his secret like a stone in his chest until cancer gave him the courage, or the fear, to finally speak. What haunts me most about this case isn't just what Robert Mitchell did in those critical moments when he chose self-preservation over a little girl's life. It's the ripple effect of that choice. A brother who grew up drowning in guilt, parents who aged decades in a matter of years, and countless other families of missing children who watched Emma's story unfold and felt their own hope die a little more. Mitchell's deathbed confession gave the Johnsons their daughter back, but it also took away the one thing that had kept them going all those years, the possibility that she might still be alive. And now they're left to wrestle with an impossible question. Is knowing the truth worth the weight of that truth? I think about Emma every time I walk through Central Park now. Every time I see a child in a Disney princess shirt holding their parent's hand. We teach our kids about stranger danger, about not talking to people in vans or accepting candy from people they don't know. But Emma did everything right. She trusted someone in uniform, someone whose job was literally to help people. And that trust cost her everything. This case should make us uncomfortable, should challenge the simple narratives we tell ourselves about how to keep our children safe. Because the reality is so much more complicated and terrifying than we want to admit. The Johnson family has asked that Emma be remembered not as a victim, but as the joyful, trusting 7-year-old who loved gymnastics and Disney princesses and believed the world was full of people who wanted to help. They've turned their grief into advocacy, working with organizations that support families of missing persons, and pushing for better protocols when children disappear in public spaces. And they've asked something of all of us: to never stop asking questions, to never assume a case is truly cold, and to remember that behind every missing child poster is a family frozen in time, waiting for answers that may never come. What do you think went through Robert Mitchell's mind every time he walked past that spot in the North Woods? How do you live with yourself for 19 years, knowing a family is suffering because of a choice you made in a moment of panic? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. If Mitchell hadn't gotten cancer, if death hadn't forced his hand, would Emma's family still be searching today? Would we ever have known what happened to her? These are the questions that don't have easy answers. The questions that make true crime more than just entertainment. They're reflections of the darkest corners of human nature and the impossible choices that haunt us long after the story ends. If Emma's story affected you, if it made you think differently about the missing children cases that flash across our news feeds and fade from memory, then do something with that feeling. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you can continue learning about these important cases. Because every missing child deserves to be remembered, every family deserves answers, and every story deserves to be told. Share Emma's story, talk about it with your family, and remember that staying informed and aware is one of the most powerful things we can do to protect the innocent and honor those we've lost. What's your take on Mitchell's confession? Do you believe it was truly an accident? Or do you think there's more to the story he never revealed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter, and your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.